Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road. Now today we look at the progress that has been made on the churchyard, and it more or less sort of completes that whole hill section. So there's sort of a number of areas that I tackled, and I kind of almost put them down to kind of like mini projects within the larger project. And of course one of the first things that I did was carry on with the embankments around the outside of the hill section where they border the railway tracks, and use the same process that I did for the embankments by the scenic side of the fiddle yard. So once I'd got all of that in place, then it was a case of tackling the churchyard itself and some of the other sort of areas near the roadside as well. Now I recall one comment from a couple of videos back where someone had suggested, rather than a sort of a flat area outside the church gates, that maybe it has a slight undulation or rise to it, and I completely agree. I thought in hindsight, yes, it possibly wouldn't have been beautifully flat, and so I have actually altered that, and it has now got a slight rise on it just to give the landscape maybe a slightly more authentic look to it. So to start with, for the churchyard, there was a little bit of preparation that took place, and one of the things I decided to do was actually put the church foundations on its own slightly raised base. Now I used a little bit of 3mm MDF to do this, and it's just basically to raise it up slightly above the ground level, so that when it came to applying scatter and static grass and things like that, that it would actually sort of come up the edges of that raised foundation, and also give the church a exact position for me to place it whenever I needed to take it on and off. Also, along with that, I created a little wee pathway that led to the church gates, and that was also at the same level as the church foundation. Then I just used a little bit of putty to build up the landscape to the level of the path, and that I think also creates a little bit more undulation in the churchyard as well, so it doesn't all look perfectly flat. Once that was done, it was a case of going over with a base coat of paint, and then it was the base scatter that was applied, and I used the same material that I used on the embankments that I did in the previous video. One of the things that I was aiming for with the churchyard was for it to not look beautifully kept and immaculate like the previous churchyard that I had, and I wanted it to look a little bit more unkept, a little bit more overgrown, and a little bit forgotten about, particularly where the headstones and cemetery would be situated. So I did a little bit of research and found some photos online of some English churches. These probably are more village or country churches, but actually some of them look very similar, of course, to the Metcalfe stone church. So in the photos you can see overgrown grass, crooked headstones, and all manner of weeds and overgrowth that has sort of taken place, and essentially that's really the type of effect that I'm aiming for with the cemetery area in particular. So with that in mind, once that base scatter had dried, it was a case of going over with varying levels of static grass, and we started with some finer 2mm grasses growing up to 4mm, and then I think also 6mm grasses, and it was really a case of layering that up. There were multiple tones, so around the edges of the actual church foundations itself, I kind of kept those grass tones more green, because I kind of felt that possibly around the church itself, where rainwater runs off the roof and things like that, that there may well actually be more sort of luscious growth around those areas, and as you get out towards into the middle of the grass areas, that maybe things are starting to die off a little bit, and where the cemetery is to be situated, of course, I had much longer dry dead grass there. So in terms of the trees that I used in the churchyard, there were some trees that I recycled from the previous churchyard, and they're kind of quite cheap plasticky trees, but I have actually sort of fixed them up a little bit, I would say, and made them a little bit more kind of realistic compared to what they used to be. And another set of trees that I've used is these heki, I think it's pronounced possibly heki or heki trees, and these come in a set. Now they're actually really quite cheap. For 40 New Zealand dollars you can get 6 trees which are 18 centimeters high, and I must admit they're not bad out of the box. I mean, you could just pop them on and away you go, but I actually found that once you actually get a little bit of scatter on them, then you can really start to play with a more realistic tree. So the one on the right hand is one that I've applied a little bit of scatter to using some hairspray and then going over it with a matte lacquer, and then this is one that hasn't been touched at all. And yeah, I mean, they actually work quite well. So $40, if I do my maths, they're sort of round about $8 each, which is not too bad, I thought, for a ready-made tree that just needs a little bit of extra. And I've also painted the trunks in a matte brown because the sort of shiny brown plastic didn't look too brilliant. So that's the trees there, and the scatter that I used actually is this material here from Knock, which is it's just called Scatter Grass Herbs, and it's just a bit of a blend actually, and that worked quite well. So the trees that you get with in the pack come with these little plastic, very unrealistic bases, but what I actually found is if you chop the actual base off it, and then I actually used the peg part where the hole is, turned that upside down and glued that into the styrene hillside, and then of course the tree just slots into it. And the reason I've done that is because I actually like the idea of being able to take the tree off if I had to pack anything away. So these trees can actually just come out and they just simply slot into place. So the churchyard is of course made up of Woodland Scenic's headstones, and this is actually a new set because I pinched a few more headstones to make up a larger collection, but the previous headstones of course I'd rescued from the old churchyard. So in the original churchyard I had a little quirky scene of a funeral or a burial taking place in the churchyard, and it's the Woodland, I think it's a Woodland Scenics figurine set, and it's a bit of a comical set because there is a pair of hands poking out from under the coffin lid, and all the people around have shocked poses and expressions on their face. So I wanted to repurpose that into the new churchyard, but what I've actually decided to do is, rather than make it a burial, it is an exhumation where they have taken a coffin out of its grave and discovered that there isn't actually anyone in the coffin. So it kind of relates to the body that was found in the cutting. So there we have it. That is the churchyard mostly complete. There's still some little bits of clump foliage that I want to do around the foundations of the church, and also dotted randomly along the stone walls at various points. So I'm quite liking the exhumation scene that I have in the churchyard, and essentially what I did is I used the Woodland Scenics coffin and I just dremeled a section of the lid off the coffin, and then also dremeled out a little bit of a cavity so that it appeared that it was hollow. Of course, one of the other things that I also did with some of the Woodland Scenics headstones is I actually cut them on angles, or I filed them on certain angles, just so that the headstones weren't all perfectly straight up and down. So in those photos that we'd previously seen, the headstones weren't all perfectly straight. They were on various angles and leaning over, and of course some broken as well. I wasn't going to go as far as that. So the only bit left to do really on this section, of course, is the road tarmac, which will be similar to what I've done for the wee path that leads up to the church. And I just use sand that I gather from the beach, and I can tone it to suit the scene. So once the road tarmac is ready, then I'll be able to actually put this into situ, align some of the other components that have already been done, and actually start to merge the elements together so we get a sort of a more or less a seamless look across the entire scene. So that'll actually include the embankments that run alongside the fiddle yard, and also the overhead bridge as well, because that needs some treatment as well. And I've also got to tidy up where the joins are so that it looks more seamless. So I think once that's all done, then I'll probably do another running session so we can actually have a look and see how it all fits into the landscape, and with a few trains running around. So it's almost dinner time now, and I was just thinking, is it fish and chip night? And then I realized, no, we had fish and chips on Friday night, because here in New Zealand it seems to be a common practice to have fish and chips on a Friday night. So tonight I believe it is actually chicken. So once again, many thanks for all the comments and the likes, and also to the new subscribers on the channel, and thank you all for watching. Do take care and look after yourselves, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.